In the last couple months, our team here at Question Everything has been playing around with this new technology. It's called Pira. It's a startup, and it uses AI to determine what people are talking about in all sorts of corners of the internet before it breaks into more mainstream conversation, and eventually the news and real life.
Is there a topic that I can kind of center the demo around? It's something that's interesting.
This is a training session Pira's CEO, Welton Chang, gave our staff a couple months ago. Welton used to be an intelligence officer for the Army. Then after 2016, when it became clear that Russia had been meddling in online spaces to influence American voters, he left, and he and a colleague ended up joining an NGO to start developing this technology to track security threats online. Hate speech, disinformation, threats of political violence. They started by focusing on what they called unmoderated social media platforms, places like Telegram, 4chan, Parler, that do less flagging and fact-checking of content than Facebook, for instance, or in some cases, none. Because they knew this is where certain ideas and obsessions and conspiracies often start to percolate, before sometimes jumping over to more mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and then into the wider conversation. They were hoping this could help them detect threats early. The tech basically vacuums up tons of posts from across these platforms, a massive amount of data each day, and then they use AI to analyze it.
We take every post and run it through our language modeling capability. So what that does is it identifies highly negative content, highly offensive, highly hateful, and highly violent.
And it was after Election Day in November 2020, when Donald Trump was claiming he'd won, and that Democrats had committed widespread voter fraud, that Welton and his colleagues saw the potential power of what they were building.
So the election results were still being tabulated. And, there was talk of, voter fraud and all this stuff in the lead up to the actual ballots being cast. Mm-hmm. But what we saw on the platforms that we were monitoring was a little bit different in that it wasn't just people spouting off. It had turned into, I'm taking a video, and here's me in a Walmart parking lot, and I'm kind of getting together with other like-minded people, and we're headed to Georgia to do a protest. We're headed to, Michigan to make our views known. And we started seeing some chatter about heading to D.C., for, a big rally at the Ellipse. It was also it being accompanied with more violent language, more hateful language.
The program actually measures how violent or hateful language is. It quantifies it on a scale.
And that's, I think it kind of got our antenna up a little bit. And then the morning of Jan 6, I remember going into our organizational Slack and saying to everybody, hey, I think something's going to go down today. It might even go, to use a military term, kinetic. And then, of course, there's the rally at the Ellipse. The folks at the Ellipse start moving towards the Capitol, right? We feel like we had like a front row seat to it, watching what was going on online.
Welton and his colleagues realized that the program they were building, you really could use it to try and anticipate the future, to maybe get ahead of a damaging conspiracy theory or even potential violence. They spun off from the NGO into this company, Pira, and expanded the sites they look at. There's now more than 40. They don't do Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram yet, and only parts of TikTok. But the program does suck in data from YouTube, Spotify podcasts, Reddit, Substack, plus what Pira sees as more left-leaning platforms, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Spoutable, Says Us, along with ones that are more right-wing, Gab, Getter, Truth Social, lots of others too. And one of the most interesting things I've found that they do is each week they use the AI to identify what they call the top narratives forming across these platforms. This is not like a trending topic or keyword on Google, like Biden or Taylor Swift or the NFL. The AI reads about 100 million posts a week, and then it clusters them together thematically and determines which ideas seem to be forming most prominently among people who are posting on all these sites. It's tricky because they're basically trying to read tea leaves in a sewer. These corners of the internet are obviously filled with garbage. There's shitposting and infighting and extremist groups and bot farms and foreign and domestic influence campaigns and posts from teenagers whose parents have taken their PlayStation controllers away and are looking for something to do. But then again, garbage ideas bubble up into our politics all the time. Pizzagate, QAnon, vaccine conspiracies, claims that government officials are geoengineering hurricanes, claims about election fraud that can lead to people amassing in D.C., breaking into the Capitol, real-life violence. The conversations online, they mirror and shape our reality every day, even if you're not aware of them. I'm certainly not tapped into them on a regular basis. And at the same time, for a lot of people, these conversations can have more influence than any news story. So I think there's value in looking at what people are talking about on these platforms, even if it can be kind of inscrutable. Hard to know which ideas will catch and which will stay festering in the pipes. From KCRW and Placement Theory, this is Question Everything. I'm Brian Reed. And on today's show, we're doing a kind of experiment I've been wanting to do since I got to know about Pyrrha. We look at the top narratives Pyrrha identified in just the last week, a relatively random week in the life of America. So we can all track them together and keep an eye on if any of them start to gain more steam. Even just this snapshot from this 1 week, it's chaotic, disjointed, bizarre. Wait, this is all from this last week?
Yeah, I mean, these are...
Oh my gosh. Okay, first of all, I was going to just read one aloud.
No, you can't. That's the thing. I have to take breaks from looking at this sometimes because it can feel like you're inside the brain of somebody having a mental health crisis.
Stick around. The guy who pulls together the narratives from Pyrrha each week is named John Reed. Pyrrha is not a journalism company, but John is a journalist who works for them. And every week he goes through what the AI identified, gives it a human check, and then puts out a newsletter outlining the most prominent narratives. John and I got together on Monday to talk about the most recent ones. I printed out the newsletter. The top narrative for the week: Bill Gates is trying to depopulate the earth and must be stopped.
Yes. The Bill Gates narrative is essentially because of his work on public health and vaccines. There's a huge claim that he's out to control the world or depopulate the world, or you name it. Some kind of, nefarious goal that he has. And it's largely tied back to his public health work. Again, this is a narrative. This is a conspiracy theory. I don't know.
Yeah, turn around, show me.
There's a wild spreadsheet I've just pulled of some of this stuff.
Right? Oh, wow. Okay.
And you can see some of them are a bit baseless.
Do you mind if I look here?
Yeah.
So this is all from this last week?
Yeah, I mean, these are from about the past week and a half, some of them, it looks like.
I mean, the first one is like, maybe 15 words and somehow manages to be
everything, like
anti-Chinese and anti-Semitic in one line.
It's wild.
Like, is there anything that's readable? Let's see here. Bill Gates should stand in front of a firing squad for crimes against humanity.
Here's another one. They are all guilty of murdering millions across the globe. Bill Gates is the puppet master. Okay. Let's see. This is a climate-oriented one. He's a pathological liar. Arrest this unelected villain, saying he's inventing fake crises for people to buy his fraudulent climate garbage. Bill Gates is angry. He wants to depopulate the earth. President Trump is standing in the way.
I guess it's not surprising to me that these theories and ideas about Bill Gates exist and get shared on platforms like these. What's surprising to me is just that this is the top narrative of the last week. Like, just the fact that this is what is getting talked about so prominently on these platforms right now, when it doesn't seem to be part of the conversation that certainly I'm tuning into as a reader of kind of more traditional news outlets.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of why now? Why is this a prominent topic of conversation now?
So I'm not sure with the Gates one, right? So sometimes it makes sense as to why these are surging. Other times it doesn't. Sometimes it feels like somebody's just taking spaghetti and throwing it at the wall.
I have possible theories. I'm curious if you see any evidence to this in what you're looking at. I know that Elon Musk, who's become a more prominent voice right now, he is of the mindset that global population needs to grow, that low birth rates are a problem, and advocates for that, and I think puts money behind it, and also has a lot of kids himself.
Right.
Could this be in response to that taking hold somewhere?
It could be.
People saying like Bill Gates is kind of anti-Elon Musk in a way or something?
So it could be that. With the Bill Gates narrative, I did notice one interesting thing, because it pops up every few weeks, the Gates narrative.
Oh, it does?
Every few weeks, every few months, yeah. Some of these recur, and they kind of ebb and flow. And the Gates ones, and I noticed that there's increasingly a focus on his work in Africa. And I have to wonder, there is a new geopolitical scramble for influence in Africa right now, where you see Russia and China have been trying to get more influence on the continent compared to the West. And that's just one of those things that makes me kind of go, I wonder what this is.
Oh, so also it's possible this isn't totally organic, this conversation. Is that what you're
right?
Right,
And that's something, exactly. These aren't always organic. Sometimes tricky, though, differentiating what's organic versus what's not. What is a bot campaign, for example, right? You can see individual posts and be like, that looks like a bot, but like how much of this is actually being driven by fake software versus how much of this is being driven by, is this just organic? People are furious about this and talking about it.
Yeah, I feel like the second one you list, does seem to be more obvious. The narrative is the Democratic Party is dying and needs to be finished off.
It should be banned. And we're seeing that narrative emerge, I should be clear, on platforms that are popular among right-leaning users.
But you also noted that it's prominent in some way or another on left-wing platforms too.
Yeah, you'll see, and a slightly different narrative oftentimes. And sometimes these messages merge, right?
Like here you have, seems like a right-wing Getter user, the Democrat power brokers only represent the elites, the credentialed, already successful. The numbers are crystal clear. In contrast, we are the movement of workers, the patriotic populace of America first.
Yeah.
And then on the left here, on a Blue Sky post, LOL, the Democratic Party is awash with donor money and corporate lobbyists. There's no working within the Democratic Party. Anybody that tries to eradicate Super PAC, APAC money is scorned at and kicked out of leadership. So there's kind of like a weird consensus there. Yeah. Is there certain language that you see show up in left-wing posts versus right-wing posts?
It seems like there was more coherent narrative development on platforms favored by the right than on the left. The left was a lot more chatter and debate, kind of loose. Whereas platforms with the right, you saw a lot more kind of more coherent narratives being pushed.
And that's like people coalescing behind
and sharing
a story or a theme or a conspiracy theory.
Exactly. Whatever it may be, right? Exactly. I noticed that a lot.
I mean, that's an observation or critique you always hear, or I've often heard of kind of at the party level, which is that Democrats are terrible at staying on one message and Republicans are much more disciplined. It's interesting that it would be true kind of in this wild west of all these.
Yeah, and the language is generally not quite as just violently angry. The calls for mass executions and things like that. You don't see those on the sites favored by the left nearly the same way that you do on the right. It's the vitriolic aggression. It's as if someone just slammed a pint of vinegar and just is going after their neighbor on some of these sites. But I did notice one interesting thing around the election, specifically on election day. For a very brief, I don't even know that I'd say it's a full 24 hours, where to me it seemed like for a half a second the rhetoric calmed down.
Huh.
As if people were just like watching to see what was going to happen. And then boop, came back. What was interesting was I noticed that it was calming down kind of on election day, before we all had the exact results, right? And then a little bit into the next day.
Yeah, that's
like
weird.
We said. That was the interesting thing. It was as if everybody was just going, hold off, wait.
All right, so what's the final top narrative you identified?
Let's dive in back
to this week.
Back to this week. It's basically arguing that Nick Fuentes, the far right, far right influencer, and kind of self-described extreme misogynist, is actually a federal informant.
Yeah, I'm not totally familiar with this conspiracy. So tell me.
So he was at on the National Mall on January 6, 2021, kind of encouraging people to go to the Capitol building, and then why hasn't he been charged with anything? He must be a Fed. He seems to be getting off scot-free. He's a Fed.
Got it. And this is coming from people on the right, it seems like?
Yeah, and this week we saw that, especially on 4chan. And that's like, are these guys just, kids on 4chan having an argument about one another? Is it an organic, just back and forth kind of internet contest, or what's driving this latest cycle? Because this is an idea that's been out there for a long time, that Nick Fuentes is a Fed. this isn't one of those things that it surges from time to time, and you can't always tell immediately. When I'm producing the newsletter, I can't always immediately see, like, what was the spark that set this latest round of this off. But this helps you understand what everybody's kind of thinking, where their brain is going, and where people may be trying to push their thinking.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, a sketchy website that should maybe be on our radar, and the narrative taking form online that John thinks is the most likely to become something we're going to have to deal with soon. In the Pura newsletter, after going through the top narratives for the week, John also lists the most shared content, like actual links people are sharing in their posts on the array of platforms that the company monitors. And that list I found both bewildering and telling in some way or another, you know? So I'm looking at this list. I think there's a list of 10. Mm-hmm. This is the most shared content, the most shared on these sites. And I have heard of I've heard of 3 of these outlets out of 10. Mm-hmm. So there's a Fox News story on here. I've heard of them, obviously. GB News is like a right-wing British outlet. I've heard of them. Newsmax is on here.
Yeah.
I've heard of them. Oh, I guess I've heard of this. I guess number 9 most shared on here was the Expedia cancellation policy. A complete guide for passengers. So I've heard of Expedia.
Yeah.
But other
right
than
ahead of Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. But other than that, I've not heard of these sites. So for instance, the number 1 piece of shared content this week on these social media sites was from AC News. I have never heard of AC News. I went to Google it and I can't find it. What is AC News? Do you have a link there? Can you look internally?
I'm looking right now for it. Oh, here we go.
This is it.
Yep.
Alternative Central News. Uncensored and independent media seeking the truth, fighting for freedom.
And we see this one shared an awful lot. When you go over to their menu and their kind of options for coverage, you see the top thing is politics, geopolitics, crime, justice, terrorism, economy, army, wars, conflict zones, military tech. Then you get into the NWO, New World Order, deep state, dictatorship, tyranny, propaganda, ideology, disinfo, control, surveillance, privacy, censorship. And the list goes on and on and on from there.
There's a category here, racism, transgender, LGBTQ+, sex crimes. Mm-hmm. That's one category.
Yep. Oh, interestingly, look at the language that the calendar is in down there in the archives. It's not an English language calendar.
It's a Czech language calendar, actually. We did a little digging this week just to see what is this site. And there's not a lot out there about it, honestly. But we sent it to some researchers who study the ways Russia and China infiltrate U.S. politics. And they were aware of it. They'd included it in a report on Russian propaganda, saying the site appears to be repackaging and reposting content from Russian state media to influence Americans. They did some more investigating after we wrote them and told us they were actually able to trace AC News to a Czech guy who shares an address in London with a crypto exchange and something called the Slavic World Foundation. Anyway, seems like a site to keep an eye on. John looked at the traffic that made this the most shared site on the Pura-monitored platforms this past week. And it was mostly coming from social media accounts created by AC News itself.
Mastodon, Blue Sky, AC News on Getter. They have a Getter account. AC News on Gab.
So it's like spreading in this whole other ecosystem. Yeah. It just shows that, okay, this site that I've never heard of that I can barely find on the normal search engine that I use is gaining influence somewhere.
Yeah. Like this doesn't quite feel like it was made by necessarily a person. This might have been AI generated, right?
There's humanity missing here.
Yeah. It's some of this is just giving me that initial gut sense, right? You can tell it's not organic, right?
Yeah.
Users pushing this out. This is all AC News pushing this stuff out.
All right, so that's the number 1 most shared piece of content is that website.
Yeah, that was on Friday's newsletter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, this one jumped out at me. This is number 3, the number 3 most shared story. This is from a site, again, I've never heard of called Real Raw News.
They are all over the place this week, too.
Really?
Yeah.
When you search on that, the way they describe themselves is Real Raw News, Science, Politics, Conspiracy, Trump. an independent publisher. Real Raw News explores content often avoided by the mainstream media. And the story that I guess is getting shared as one of the top stories on these social media sites in the last week or so is that Anita Dunn was executed at Gitmo. Anita Dunn is one of Joe Biden's advisors.
Yeah.
Who's still alive.
Yes, very much still alive.
Well, I went to the story, and not only is it just an insane, lie, it's basically a piece of fiction. Yes. It's from February 2022.
You see that sometimes. People just recycling, right? It's kind of like the Nick Fuentes is a Fed story. Sometimes that just comes back.
So say more about that. Like, what are the forces behind that? Why does that happen? Why is this lie that Anita Dunn, Joe Biden's advisor, was executed at Gitmo that was written in this story 2 years ago or more?
Why is that the number 3 story last Friday? I can't tell specifically in that case, but I mean, it coincides with a whole kind of an upswing again lately in kind of the prosecute Biden, prosecute Democrats in power, they're corrupt, this kind of thing, narrative that's been flourishing again since the election that we've seen, right? That's my guess, is that we've seen an upswing in all of this talk of, Democratic politicians and operatives are, evil and this and that, and they're involved in all sorts of conspiracies. And some of them get just absolutely wild.
I mean, just to read this, Anita Dunn did not have a happy Valentine's Day. Again, this is from February 2022, and yet it's one of the most shared stories right now. No flowers, no chocolates, and no cards embossed with cute hearts. She did, however, have her head put in a noose at Guantanamo Bay, where she was hanged to death following a lengthy self-imposed hunger strike.
So you see a lot of that kind of generalized. Biden's are treasonous, people in his orbit are treasonous, this kind of thing. You see an awful lot of that rhetoric, right? And it's often accompanied with executions.
But with this actually saying an execution happened at the hands of the U.S. government?
Oh, they've done that about Biden, I believe. I think they've even said that, Biden's, body double and the real one was executed or something like that. You see that sometimes.
Is it common or it's just not uncommon?
I would say it's not uncommon. I've definitely seen that trope before. There is this bloodlust in some of the posts that I'm seeing that kind of is really disconcerting, to say the least.
What have you learned from doing this week after week?
I don't know if I've learned it from this, but I've really internalized just how you can see these kind of ideas germinate and spread, right? This is something that I've known kind of intellectually for a long time, but then watching them week after week spread this way, it is different. It's like when you experience something versus when you just read about it, right? Watching it in real time happen. An example that comes to mind is in October, we saw about a week, maybe 2 before it started to gain real traction in the mainstream, there was the narrative that claimed that Tim Walz had been kind of sexually grooming or abusing a Kazakh exchange student that famously hit the news cycle in October. We saw that one pop up about a week or 2 before it really blew up.
And that was not true, just to be clear.
Exactly, yes.
Got it.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's just one example of how we tend to see these narratives germinate. I saw that pop up and I said, what? Okay, sure. It's trending now, but I didn't think that much of it. It was just one of many kind of crazy sounding stories that you can see on these sites. And you don't always know which one's going to take off or which one's going to get attention in mainstream, right? And that was one of those where, sure enough, boom, then a few weeks later or a week or 2 later, it caught on. Like I'll click a New York Times headline and all of a sudden they're talking about this crazy sounding narrative that I wrote a very quick bit about a few weeks before that was only on, Getter or Gab or a handful of those sites. And then the Times will say how it's just all over X or Facebook or, whatever platform it is. And I said, wow. And it's shocking how it gets that pickup.
And it's like arguably possibly influencing how people are thinking about the election or the Democratic ticket.
And I suppose there's some kind of meta point to be made about how we're all retreating into our individualized kind of narrative ecosystems where people just go down these rabbit holes and their ideas are being reinforced by one another and by networks of people. You really do see it here where it's just all these little soda straws of realities.
When I dip into Pyrrha like this, I do end up thinking about my little soda straw. What am I drinking? What's my reality? Before we wrapped up, I asked John if there was anything else notable he was seeing this week, and he said actually there was one narrative that he just clued into that morning that he thought, out of all the ones we discussed, out of all the sewage we were sifting through, actually this could be the most likely to emerge as a real situation we might have to contend with soon. And it wasn't anything I'd come across in my own news consumption.
Over the weekend and late last week, a bunch of chatter about the Romanian election.
I saw that in your political newsletter.
Yeah. So
I didn't even know there was an election happening in Romania.
There's this the presidential election where, out of nowhere, seemingly, according to most news reports, this ultranationalist presidential candidate who seems to have a very serious affinity for the Kremlin, isn't necessarily the biggest fan of the EU and NATO, won kind of the first round of Romania's elections. And there's been a lot of talk of possible interference from the Kremlin. And so Romania's court ordered a recount. And so he just kind of came out of almost nowhere. It seems like nobody was tracking this guy. And then bang, he wins the first round of the election. And so a lot of the commentary we saw over the last few days about it has been saying, whoa, who's this guy? So a lot of people just sharing this kind of surprise news and links to it. But then we also do see some posts going in, not an overwhelming amount yet, but saying that it is a CIA or Western intelligence operation, that the recount has got to be a Western intelligence operation. This is a case where this could percolate into a proper narrative that really runs away, that like this is the West interfering in Romania's election to keep the people's choice out of office or something like that.
Yeah, I could see this being like a big news story pretty soon.
Right. This is the kind of thing that this may blow up. Maybe it might not go anywhere. Who knows?
Oh, that's interesting.
So yeah, that's just one of these things that, you know, we're seeing what may be the early phases of a messaging campaign around this candidate to say that, you know, the West's conspiring to keep him out of office or something like that.
John Reed. We are not related, by the way. He works for Pura Technologies. On our next show, in a change of pace, I get together a bunch of Hollywood directors who have all mined journalism to make some of my favorite movies and TV shows. We open a bottle of whiskey and talk shop, including Tom McCarthy, who made Spotlight. When did you know Spotlight was a story?
When I knew it was a story?
Or when it was a movie. When did you know Spotlight was a movie?
Can I switch to Scotch if we're going to do this?
Yeah, you haven't already?
I haven't. I've been stuck in red wine.
Today's episode was produced by me, with Sophie Kazis. It was edited by Jonathan Goldstein and Jen Kinney. Our show is made by executive producer Robyn Semien, producer Zach St. Louis, and production intern Emily Malterre. Neil Drumming is a contributing editor. Fact-checking by Maggie Duffy. Sound design this week by Sharif Youssef. Music by Matt McGinley. Our partners at KCRW include Arnie Seipel, Gina Delvac, Tejal Ajmera, and Jennifer Ferro. Thanks for listening. See you next time.